November 7th, 2017, this quiet and coastal town of Swanage in England was interrupted by a frantic scene. Gaia Pope, who was this bright and spirited 19-year-old girl, was seen sprinting barefoot through the streets. Her breathing laboured, her eyes filled with panic. She banged on doors, begged for help, and at one point even placed a desperate 999 call. Then, as suddenly as she appeared, Gaia vanished. Her disappearance sparked this cascade of confusion and fear. Where had she gone, and what could have driven her to get into such a state? What followed was the unravelling of cryptic clues, shocking revelations, and heartbreaking discoveries. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. To understand Gaia's story, you really need to know who she was, the kind of person she was. She was described as passionate and full of life. She was an aspiring artist, and she was a fierce advocate for social justice. She had this twin sister, Maya, who she really had an unbreakable kind of bond with. But beneath her vibrant personality, Gaia really struggled. She battled this severe PTSD and mental health challenges after surviving a horrific ordeal just 2 years earlier. It was the summer of 2015 when Gaia Pope first crossed paths with Connor Hayes. At the time, Gaia was 17. She was a really vibrant teenager, full of dreams and hopes and this unshakable zest for life. She spent her days sketching in her notebook and planning the future for herself. And she really loved her hometown in Swanage. She would just spend the days soaking up the sun and enjoying life. Connor Hayes was older. He was charismatic with this kind of rough edge that some found magnetic, but others found unsettling. He ran in a different circle, one that Gaia wouldn't normally be a part of, but through a mutual acquaintance, their worlds collided. Connor presented himself as approachable, a guy who got along with everyone. To Gaia, who was always eager to connect with people, he seemed harmless. At first, their interactions were pretty ordinary. It was brief conversations, passing jokes. Connor had this way of making people feel quite comfortable and at ease. Now, over time, his interest in Gaia became much more apparent, shifting from friendly towards something much more insidious. One evening in early 2015, Gaia found herself at a small gathering at a mutual friend's house. It wasn't unusual, a group of people, young people drinking, laughing, sharing stories into the night. Gaia was warm, she was social, she was really just her usual self, laughing as the night went on. Now at some point, Connor offered to walk her home. It was late and Gaia hesitated initially, but she saw this offer as something that seemed really genuine. She didn't see any reason to distrust Connor. Why would she? She lived in this small town where people looked out for one another. But as they walked, something shifted. Connor kind of strayed away from the conversation they were having and it went into uncomfortable territory. He was making comments that made Gaia feel uncomfortable, and although she tried to brush it off and just get home safely, he would not let it go. Then, as they passed an isolated area, Connor's charm turned to be more predatory. He became forceful. His demeanour was cold and unrelenting, and Gaia did fight. She tried to fight him off, but Connor overpowered her and assaulted her. The attack was brutal and it left Gaia emotionally and physically shattered. Afterwards, Gaia did manage to get home. Her mind was just a blur of confusion and pain. She didn't know how to process what had just happened. The vibrant, very spirited girl who left that gathering had now been changed forever. She was a shell of herself. She was terrified, ashamed, and she just didn't know what to do next. For days afterwards, Gaia kept the assault to herself, but the weight of it was suffocating, and eventually she did decide to confide in her family. Her twin sister Maya, who was the first to hear the truth of what had happened, decided that they needed to go and report what had happened, and Gaia agreed. She thought that that should happen too. Gaia showed immense bravery in coming forward and telling police everything. She had to really relive that trauma as she detailed Connor's actions. But the process was grueling, and despite her courage, the investigation into the attack moved slowly, and cracks began to form in the system that was supposed to protect her and that she really believed would protect her. In the end, the Crown Prosecution Service, or CPS, decided that they weren't going to prosecute Connor. They cited lack of sufficient evidence, and this decision really devastated Gaia. It left her feeling like her voice didn't matter. The lack of accountability haunted her, and it made her PTSD and anxiety way more intense, and they would just get worse in the years to come. Gaia didn't just lose her sense of safety that night. She lost her trust in the system that was meant to bring her justice. What happened that night really was a turning point in Gaia's life, setting off a chain reaction of trauma, self-doubt, and this relentless fight for validation. It was a moment that could never be undone, and its ripple effects would lead down a path that ultimately ended in tragedy. The trauma left her reeling, and although her family did really try and support her, those scars ran deep. Gaia was known for her resilience, but the pain that she carried often bubbled to the surface in ways that really worried those that were close to her. The day Gaia disappeared began like any other, but by nightfall, it would spiral into chaos. CCTV footage captured her walking through Swanage, dressed in just a crop top, leggings and no shoes, which was very odd considering that it's November, it's a real chilly winter weather. A few hours later, her clothes were found discarded in a field. But as for Gaia, she seemed to have just disappeared into thin air. Even more unsettling were her final text messages, just sent shortly before she disappeared. They hinted at fear, paranoia, and she thought she was being followed. This wasn't just a missing persons case. It was a puzzle where all of the pieces just didn't seem to fit. As the days passed with no sign of Gaia, her family really became her voice. They organised searches, they rallied for the community to come together, and they just begged for anyone that knew anything to come forward and help them. Her mother Natasha and her twin sister Maya appeared on TV asking for help. Now the case caught the public's attention, and soon Swanage was flooded with volunteers, search parties and media crews. Everyone wanted to know, where was Gaia Pope? As the investigation intensified, one name surfaced repeatedly, and that was Connor Hayes. Now, of course, Connor wasn't just anyone. He was the person who had been accused of raping her 2 years earlier. We know that those charges were eventually dropped, but they had really affected Gaia. Connor had a troubling history. He had a criminal record and a reputation that really did raise eyebrows. For Gaia, her family suspected that he was somehow connected to her disappearance. But Connor wasn't the only one under scrutiny. One of Gaia's neighbours and acquaintances, she had interacted with him, he was questioned. On top of this, there was an elderly couple that were living relatively nearby, and they found themselves in the centre of the investigation. They had found some of Gaia's clothing near to where she disappeared, but there was some conflicting accounts in what they both said, and it really added some confusion over what had actually happened that night. This couple also claimed to have seen a woman matching Gaia's description at the time when she disappeared. They said that she was near their property. They recognised her. Now, this woman, they said, she appeared distressed and she was disoriented. She was wandering aimlessly down a remote path. When they approached her to offer her help, she allegedly fled into the surrounding undergrowth, just vanishing into the darkness, and they never saw her again. But what was strange was that the couple's account was inconsistent. At first, they said they'd seen Gaia the same night she went missing, but later they completely revised their timeline to suggest that it might have been days afterwards instead, and they couldn't be sure. This discrepancy really muddied the timeline investigators had tried to establish, and it raised some questions. If Gaia had been alive and near the property during the initial search, then why hadn't anyone found her? Could she have been hiding? Or were the couple mistaken entirely? Their account added an unsettling level of ambiguity, and it really casted doubt over what was already a fragmented and quite complex case. As days turned into weeks, frustrations mounted. the police faced real criticism for their handling of Gaia's case, particularly with their failure to prosecute Connor Hayes and their apparent discouragement that she seek justice. Gaia had been let down by the very systems that were meant to protect her, and now, as her family anxiously waited for answers, those failures became glaringly evident. For 11 days, the search for Gaia Pope consumed the small town of Swanage. Hundreds of volunteers scoured the coastline, fields and dense woods surrounding the area. They were all driven by this desperate hope that she might still be alive. Every passing hour weighed heavier than the last, and the quiet dread among the searchers began to grow. What if they were no longer looking for a rescue, but a recovery? It was November 18th, a particularly cold and grey day. There was this volunteer search party that was out walking along this remote coastal path on what's called Dancing Ledge. They stumbled across this overgrown area of really dense underbrush. The spot was rugged and isolated, and it perched near the actual cliffside, a place that could be easily overlooked even during an extensive search. As one of the volunteers moved to check this kind of hidden dip in the terrain, they froze. There, partially concealed beneath foliage, was a body. It was a harrowing moment, one where the searchers' worst fears really were realised. Police were immediately called to the scene, and they cordoned off the area, and forensics teams worked to recover the remains. The body was later confirmed to be Gaia Pope. She had been discovered just 3 miles from her home, in an area that had been searched multiple times before. This revelation sent shockwaves through the community. How had they missed her? The location, though remote, wasn't entirely inaccessible, and its proximity to previous search areas only deepened the mystery. The discovery raised agonising questions. Had Gaia been there all along, or had she been moved or placed there during the 11 days? When Gaia's body was discovered, the suspicion, of course, immediately went back to Connor Hayes. The days leading up to her disappearance only deepened suspicion. Gaia had been increasingly anxious, she was expressing fears for her safety, and she was referencing her unresolved trauma. To her family, they really believed that Connor might have had a role to play in her death. And the public, too, latched onto this possibility. Connor's criminal record, his reputation, this picture of a man who was definitely capable of harm. Could he have confronted her? Could he have hurt her? Was he somehow responsible for those 11 days of agony during which this entire community searched for her? The pressure mounted, and Connor was brought in for questioning. His ties to Gaia, her suffering, made him the prime suspect, certainly in the public's eye. Now, for days, it seemed inevitable that evidence would surface that would lead directly to him and link her death. But in this kind of cruel twist, that narrative shattered. When the medical examiner released their findings, they were as baffling as they were devastating. Gaia's cause of death was officially ruled as hypothermia. There were no signs of third-party involvement. No evidence of assault, no indication that anyone had physically harmed her. The revelation stunned the community, and it left Gaia's family just reeling. For all the suspicion surrounding Connor, it appeared as though Gaia's death had been a tragic accident. The ruling of hypothermia did, however, raise its own haunting questions. Hypothermia, while seemingly straightforward, was difficult to reconcile with the circumstances of Gaia's disappearance. How had she ended up alone in this really remote area, underdressed and freezing in the November temperatures? The theory pieced together by investigators was harrowing. Gaia's mental health had been fragile in the days leading up to her disappearance. Witnesses reported that she did seem disorientated and fearful, and her erratic behaviour suggested that she might have been in the midst or in the grip of a mental health crisis. This could have led her to the wilderness, seeking refuge from an imagined threat. Once in the harsh terrain, the combination of physical exhaustion, emotional distress, and that plunging temperatures in November, that could have overwhelmed her. Her discarded clothing, which was found in the search, there is this classic symptom of what's known as paradoxical undressing. It's a phenomenon where hypothermia victims in their final moments have this intense sensation of heat, and so they removed their clothes. While the hypothermia explained the physical cause of her death, it left a gaping hole in the emotional truth. Why had Gaia felt so afraid? Why was she driven to flee in the first place? The discovery that Gaia's death was not caused by Connor Hayes or by any other third party didn't completely absolve the systems that had failed her. Her allegations against Connor had been dismissed, leaving her with no closure. Her mental health struggles had gone largely unsupported by the healthcare system. And of course, the police had failed to act decisively when she needed them most. The ripple effects of these tragedies were undeniable. In the end, the tragedy wasn't just how Gaia had died, but how she had been failed at every turn leading up to it. I read about one of those failures, which I wanted to share in this part of the case. By 2016, Gaia's mental health had gotten pretty bad. She was fighting battles on multiple fronts, and she'd been dealing with epilepsy for most of her life, but it was getting worse even though she was having ongoing treatment. On top of this, the trauma of the attack that happened 2 years earlier was continuing to haunt her. Gaia sought solace in weekly counselling sessions through Dorset's sexual trauma and recovery services. But by September of that year, the safety net that Gaia so desperately needed began to fray. She was actually discharged from the mental health services, and she didn't have a referral to an adult care centre. Her counselling through the Trauma Recovery Centre also ended, leaving her to just navigate her PTSD alone. Now, Gaia was also allegedly discouraged from submitting a victim's right to review. It's this programme that could have allowed the Crown Prosecution Service to completely reassess the decision to not prosecute Connor. It was yet another blow, one that left Gaia feeling even more abandoned by those very institutions that were there to protect her. But the nightmare did not stop there. In December 2016, Connor pleaded guilty to a completely unrelated sexual offence, a moment that should have brought some relief. But instead, this added insult to injury. Connor sent Gaia's family a screenshot showing that he had sent her a Facebook friend request, a chilling reminder that he was able to be in her life. His presence was there. Now, Gaia did report this incident to the police, hoping for a protection order, but none was granted. By February 2017, Gaia's mental health had deteriorated to the point that she was involuntarily admitted into a psychiatrical hospital in Dorset called St Anne's. Another patient sexually harassed her. When Gaia bravely reported that assault, no action was taken. Just 2 days later, she was discharged and she was deemed low risk, with once again no referrals or safeguards in place whatsoever. By October, Gaia had reached breaking point. She suffered this very severe mental health crisis, and when she was assessed in hospital, her distress was unfortunately dismissed. She was deemed low risk. This was just a month before her death, and she was discharged without support, an all too familiar pattern. Then in November, the past came rushing back. A man sent Gaia a sexually explicit image via Facebook Messenger, and this triggered vivid memories and flashbacks of her assault. It was overwhelming, and Gaia did actually report this to police. She was scheduled to meet with them on the 7th of November 2017, but she would never make that meeting. Now, Connor was recently arrested for a sexual offence. The police said at that time he was working as a webcam model, selling videos and live footage of himself engaging in sexual acts. During sentencing on the 26th of November, Connor was also placed on the sex offenders register for 10 years. As well as this, a previous sexual harm prevention order was extended to 2028, and it was amended to stop him from contacting girls under the age of 16. This was because of an offence where he had been jailed for 2 years after he admitted taking an indecent photo of a child, possession of indecent images of a child, and paying for the sexual services of a child. That is what Dorset police have said. Yeah, this case is pretty grim, and I wanted to include it. I know it's not an out-and-out murder, but I truly do believe that Gaia died because of a number of failings that all started with Connor Hayes' actions towards her, and he was not prosecuted. She did not get justice, and clearly, based on the arrests that I've just spoken about and the convictions, he has gone on to do that to other women and girls. I just wanted to say as well, I really appreciate you being here. I've been a little bit quiet on YouTube the past couple of weeks. I think it's been about 3 weeks since my last upload, and I was uploading like 2, 3, 4 times a week some weeks before that, but unfortunately YouTube is really hard to make any money from, and I hate to talk about money on here, but I think it's really important because you guys should know why I'm not bringing out more episodes. So I am having to focus my time on other things, on my other work, and one of those things is the podcast. So there are loads of new episodes on the podcast. If you want to take a look at that, that will be in the description box down below. But other than that, I will be bringing you YouTube episodes. They might just be a little bit more infrequent. As always, I appreciate your support and I hope to get them up soon. Other than that, please like, comment, subscribe, rate, review, blah, 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 because it does help increase engagement and hopefully means I'll be able to make more YouTube videos in the future. Other than that, I will see you very soon for your next episode of Red Rum. Bye.